The injection kit sat on the metal table beside a stack of medical files, waiting for a decision nobody wanted to make. In a dusty enclosure just outside Nairobi, a 3-week-old elephant named Asher lay motionless in the corner, his breathing so shallow that the rise and fall of his ribs was barely visible. An infection had spread through both eyes after his mother died, leaving him in complete darkness. The poachers who took her had vanished into the bush 2 days earlier, and now this calf was fading fast, refusing every bottle of milk the veterinary team offered. 72 hours without food meant the decision was no longer optional. If Asher didn't eat by sunrise, they would have to let him go. Across the compound in the ranger's quarters, a golden retriever named Copper lay motionless against the wall, his gaze fixed on a pair of worn leather boots sitting in the corner. The boots had belonged to Samuel, a Maasai warrior and Michael's closest friend, who died 3 months ago defending his cattle from a lion. Since that terrible morning, Copper had barely touched his food, and the light that used to shine in his eyes had dimmed to almost nothing. Michael stood between the two enclosures as the sky began to lighten, checking his watch every few minutes. He was a ranger who had spent 20 years in the Kenyan bush, and he'd faced down armed poachers and survived close calls with elephants and buffalo. But watching these two fade away was something different entirely. He looked from the dying elephant to the grieving dog, and something clicked in his mind, a desperate idea that made no logical sense but felt like the only option left. He walked to Copper's quarters, lifted the leather leash from its hook on the wall, and headed back toward the elephant stall with the dog trailing behind him. Michael clipped the leash onto Copper's collar, and the dog followed without resistance, his head hanging low and his paws dragging through the red dust. When they reached the stall gate, Michael pulled it open, and the old hinges released a long creak that echoed across the quiet compound. The moment Copper's paws touched the straw-covered floor, Asher's head snapped up and the blind calf scrambled to his feet faster than Michael thought possible. The elephant released a high-pitched scream that bounced off the corrugated metal roof, and his front leg came down hard against the packed earth, sending up a cloud of dust that hung in the early morning air. Copper's entire body went stiff as a board, his lips peeling back to show his teeth, and within seconds he was barking with such ferocity that the sound filled every corner of the barn. The dog lunged backward with enough force to yank the leash clean through Michael's grip, and Asher's trunk began whipping through the air in wild arcs, searching for an enemy he couldn't see but knew was there. Michael dove forward and wrapped both arms around Copper's chest, dragging the snarling dog backward through the doorway before either animal could get hurt. He pulled the gate shut behind them, and the metal latch clanged into place with a sound that felt like failure. Outside in the settling dust, Michael sat down hard against the wooden fence and dropped his head into his hands, listening as Asher's panicked breathing gradually slowed back into that awful, dying rhythm. He'd just made everything worse, and now there were less than 60 minutes left before sunrise. Sometime deep in the night, while Michael dozed fitfully in a wooden chair outside the stall, something shifted in the darkness, and the leash that had been looped around the chair's armrest went slack. Copper had worked his head free from the collar, and the dog, who hadn't shown interest in anything for 3 solid months, rose quietly to his feet and padded across the compound with his claws clicking softly against the stone. He didn't head toward the main gate or circle back to the ranger quarters where his food bowl sat untouched. Instead, he found a gap in the old wooden fencing where 2 boards had rotted through, and he squeezed his body through the splintered opening until he was inside Asher's enclosure. When the first pink light of dawn touched the horizon and Michael's eyes opened with a start, he checked his watch and saw there were only 13 minutes left until the deadline. The stall was completely silent, and his heart dropped as he jumped to his feet and ran toward the enclosure, his boots pounding against the hard ground. He reached the metal bars and froze in place, his hands gripping the cold steel. Copper was lying curled up tight against the elephant's belly with his golden fur pressed into the wrinkled gray skin. And there was no barking, no growling, just the steady rhythm of 2 creatures breathing in sync. Asher's trunk lay draped across the dog's back, rising and falling gently with each breath that Copper took, and the calf looked more peaceful than he had since the day they brought him in. Michael watched without moving as Asher slowly shifted his weight and extended his trunk across Copper's head, pausing at the soft fur around the ears before moving down to the shoulder and back up again. The blind calf was learning the shape of this creature who had chosen to stay, and a low rumble vibrated from somewhere deep in the elephant's chest. The first sound Michael had heard from him that wasn't born from terror or pain. Then Asher stood up on legs that trembled but held his weight, and he shuffled across the straw toward the milk bottle that hung from the gatepost. He latched onto it and drained the entire thing in less than 30 seconds, and Michael felt his hands tighten around the bars until his knuckles turned white. From that morning forward, Copper refused to leave the stall, so Michael brought the dog's food bowl inside and set it near the corner. Copper would eat quickly and then immediately return to Asher's side, settling in close enough that their bodies touched. 3 days later, when they attempted their first walk in the exercise yard, something extraordinary began to take shape. Copper trotted several feet ahead of the elephant, scanning the ground with his nose low, and when he came upon a large rock jutting up from the path, he stopped immediately and released one sharp, clean bark. Asher froze in his tracks, extended his trunk forward in a slow, sweeping motion until he found the obstacle, and then carefully adjusted his path around it before continuing forward. Michael stood at the fence, watching this new language develop between them, and over the following weeks, the pattern became so refined it looked almost rehearsed. Copper would scout ahead, and whenever he detected a hole in the ground, a fallen branch, or any change in elevation, he would stop and bark with a specific tone that Asher learned to recognize instantly. The blind elephant would pause, investigate with his trunk, and navigate around whatever blocked his way. The elephant, who had been wasting away, began to fill out as the weeks passed, his ribs disappearing beneath healthy skin, and he started engaging in play for the first time, mock charging toward the sound of Copper's paws hitting the dirt, stopping just short with a playful rumble that made the dog's tail wag in circles. Copper, who had been a hollow shell for 3 months, started finishing his meals in record time so he could race back to the enclosure, and the dog, who hadn't barked since Samuel died, was now barking constantly, but only those specific warnings that kept Asher safe from harm. 6 months later, the sky turned a deep bruised purple, and rain began hammering the tin roof with a sound like 1,000 drums beating at once. Within 20 minutes, the dry riverbeds that crisscrossed the sanctuary had transformed into churning channels of muddy brown water, and the entire compound was flooding faster than anyone had seen in a decade. Michael and 3 other rangers were already waist-deep in thick mud, hauling frightened antelope and zebra toward higher ground, while thunder crashed overhead and drowned out most of their shouting. In all the chaos and confusion, the main paddock gate gave way when the water pressure became too much for the old rusted hinges, and the wooden barrier swung wide open. Asher was out there somewhere in the storm, and when Michael finally spotted him from the ridge, the blind elephant was spinning in panicked circles as floodwater climbed past his knees, and the current pulled hard at his legs, dragging him steadily toward the main channel where the river had swollen into a deadly, fast-moving torrent. Michael started running, screaming Asher's name into the wind, but the mud grabbed at his boots with every step, and each time he moved forward, he sank 6 inches deeper. His voice was swallowed completely by the storm, and he knew with terrible certainty that he wouldn't reach them in time. But Copper was already moving, tearing across the flooded ground and barking with everything he had, though the thunder was so loud it swallowed every sound he made. When the dog realized his voice wasn't reaching Asher, he stopped barking entirely and launched himself straight into the churning water. The current caught him immediately and spun him downstream a full 5 feet before he managed to fight his way back, swimming hard against the flow until he reached the panicking elephant. He clamped his jaws gently around the very tip of Asher's trunk, not biting down but just holding on, and he pulled hard to the right. Asher went completely still at the familiar touch. Copper released the trunk and swam several feet towards solid ground before turning back and barking once, sharp and clear. Asher took one shaking step in that direction, and the dog immediately swam back, pressing his body firmly against the elephant's front leg before swimming forward again to mark the path. One step, then another, and Copper kept swimming back and forth between Asher and safety, building an invisible bridge through the rising flood. A thick branch came spinning through the current and slammed hard into both of them, and Copper disappeared beneath the surface in an explosion of muddy water. Michael's boots finally found solid ground on the ridge, and he stood there watching in horror as the spot where the dog had been turned into a churning whirlpool of debris and foam. Then a golden head burst through the surface, coughing and sputtering, and without hesitation, Copper began paddling frantically back to Asher's side, refusing to stop even for a second. Step by agonizing step, the dog continued guiding the blind giant through water that had now risen to the elephant's chest, and the current was strong enough to push Asher sideways with every step. But Copper kept adjusting and correcting, swimming back and forth to keep them on the right path. When they finally reached the muddy bank and pulled themselves onto higher ground, both of them collapsed in a heap beneath the spreading branches of an acacia tree. Asher's trunk came to rest gently over Copper's soaked body, and the dog began licking mud from the elephant's face in slow, deliberate strokes. Michael reached them 2 minutes later with his clothes torn and a deep gash bleeding down his forearm, and he sat down in the mud beside them without saying a word, staying there until the storm finally passed and the water began to recede. 3 years rolled by, and Asher grew into a massive adolescent bull with tusks that curved outward in elegant arcs, while Copper's muzzle gradually turned from golden to white. Cataracts began clouding the dog's eyes until he was bumping into fence posts and water troughs he had walked past without trouble 1,000 times before. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the roles between them reversed completely. Copper was moving stiffly along the perimeter fence with his clouded eyes staring straight ahead, his senses too dulled by age to detect the danger that had been circling the compound for the past 2 hours. A male lion, ribs showing clearly through matted and scarred fur, had been stalking the fence line looking for weakness, and it had finally found a section where the wire had pulled loose from a post. The predator slipped through the gap and locked its yellow eyes on the old, slow-moving dog. It dropped into a crouch with hind legs coiling beneath its body, muscles bunching tight, and claws digging into the dry earth as it prepared to launch. Copper kept walking forward, completely unaware that death was crouched just 3 meters behind him. But 50 meters away, Asher's ears suddenly snapped forward, and his trunk, which had been casually pulling grass, stopped mid-motion and rose straight up into the air. His nostrils flared wide as he caught the sharp musk of the predator cutting through the afternoon heat. The lion launched itself through the air, with claws fully extended, aiming for the vulnerable spot at the back of Copper's neck. The ground beneath everyone's feet erupted in a violent tremor as Asher charged forward like a derailed freight train, covering 50 meters in just a handful of seconds. The earth actually shook under the weight of 4 tons of blind, absolute fury moving at full speed. The lion was already airborne when Asher arrived, and the elephant's trunk whipped through space like an enormous club, creating a sharp whistle as it cut through the air. The sheer force of the swing, combined with the massive wall of displaced air that came with it, caught the lion mid-leap and sent the predator tumbling sideways through the dust. The lion hit the ground hard and rolled 3 complete times before it could scramble back to its feet. Asher planted himself directly over Copper's trembling body and spread his ears out to their maximum width, nearly 2 full meters across, transforming himself into a wall of pure protective rage. He released a trumpet that was so loud and so filled with fury that Michael felt it vibrate deep in his chest from all the way across the compound. The lion stared up at this blind elephant who had just destroyed its carefully planned ambush, and in that split second, the predator made a calculation about survival. It turned and bolted back through the broken section of fence, disappearing into the dense bush without looking back. Asher didn't pursue or give chase. Instead, he spun around immediately, and his trunk began running frantically over Copper's entire body, checking legs and back and neck for any sign of injury, all while releasing low, soothing rumbles from deep in his throat. The old dog, confused and shaking, simply leaned his graying head against the elephant's massive front leg and closed his cloudy eyes. They stood there together in the fading afternoon light, not moving, as the sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon. 4 months later, Copper died peacefully in his sleep, curled up in the soft hay of the elephant stall, with Asher's trunk resting gently across his back, just like it had on that first morning, when everything changed. Michael dug the grave himself beneath the acacia tree where they used to play, refusing offers of help from the other rangers, and Asher stood at the fence the entire time with his trunk reaching through the bars toward the sounds of digging. For 3 full days after the burial, the elephant wouldn't leave that fence line, standing in the exact same spot and facing the tree as if he could somehow will his friend back into existence. On the 4th day, he finally turned and walked away. 2 years later, when Asher was released into a protected reserve where he could live out his life in the wild, Michael began tracking something unusual through the monitoring equipment he'd set up across the territory. Whenever a new orphan arrived in that sector of the reserve, whether it was a frightened rhino calf, a zebra foal that had been separated from its herd, or another traumatized elephant, Asher was always the very first to appear. The blind bull would approach slowly and carefully, extending his trunk to offer a gentle touch, and then he would stay with them for hours or sometimes even days, guiding them to water sources and standing between them and anything that might pose a threat. Michael documented this pattern, repeating itself 17 times over the course of 5 years, and each time he witnessed it, he saw the same gentleness and patience that Copper had once shown to a dying elephant calf in a dark stall. One evening, as the sun dropped low and turned the tall savanna grass into waves of liquid gold, Michael sat on the hood of his truck and watched Asher through binoculars. The massive bull was standing beside a young elephant calf whose mother had been lost to poachers just 2 weeks earlier, and Asher's trunk rested gently across the frightened calf's back in a gesture that Michael had seen 100 times before. He lowered the binoculars and rubbed his tired eyes, and when he looked back up, he saw something that made him pause. For just a brief moment in the tall grass beside Asher, there was a flash of gold, a shape running alongside the elephant before it vanished into the evening light. He blinked hard and looked again, but there was nothing there except grass moving in the wind. Yet Asher's head had turned slightly to the side, as if he was tracking something invisible moving through the grass right next to him. And for several seconds, the blind elephant seemed to be listening to something that only he could hear. Michael put the binoculars away and started the truck's engine, driving slowly back to camp as darkness settled across the reserve and the first stars began appearing in the deepening sky. No matter how broken you feel or how dark your world becomes, connection has a way of finding you when you need it most, and trust has the power to rebuild what grief has torn apart. If this story touched something in you, please share it with someone who might need the reminder that they're not alone in their struggle. Drop a comment below and tell me about the bravest thing you've ever witnessed. I make it a point to read every single one. Until next time, keep your heart open to the unexpected moments that can change everything.